Hey guys, this is John, and I'm playing pawnpusher10 in a 15 plus 2 game on leechess.org. Let's open with e4 this game. Strong opponent, over 2200. And we're going to get a Caro-Kann. I've been facing an inordinate number of Caro-Kanns lately, I feel. I might be exaggerating how often I face this defense, but in my mind, it seems like I'm getting it like half the time when I play e4. At least in my non-bullet games. So what to do against this line? I'm going to play d4 for starters. And then after d5, I might go for a Panov-Botvinnik Variation because I like the IQP positions that it tends to produce. And I don't quite feel comfortable in the mainline Caro-Kanns since it's been so long since I've studied e4 theory from white side with any serious depth. So I think playing this way, which kind of takes the game into more d-pawn style territory, is all right. And I say d-pawn style territory because when the tension between these pawns is resolved, either white taking on d5 or black taking on c4 at some stage, it often produces these positions where white has the isolated queen's pawn, which you would be much more likely to get out of a d-pawn opening than an e4 opening. So black just plays e6. Let's develop knight f3. And they can send the bishop to either e7 or out to b4. It's up to black. Both are acceptable. Yeah, knight c6, decent move. And I'll play bishop d3. In this case, I like the d3 square because knight b4 is not as big of a deal as it would be if my queen was on c2. If you recall, in the previous game against the Llama Lord, that was an issue. I had a queen on c2, and I specifically played my bishop out to e2 to avoid a knight b4 problem. So now that my bishop's developed, black plays a standard move, capturing on c4, and then the bishop out. Black was waiting for me to play the bishop out so they could take and make me waste time, moving the bishop twice. It's totally standard stuff. Okay, this is actually transposing to a line that I recommended in the d4 repertoire for white on Chessable. I know it sounds like I'm plugging Chessable constantly, but I keep getting lines that I recommended and analyzed in my repertoires for Chessable, so I might as well mention it. I actually looked at this line via the Queen's Gambit accepted move order, so it's interesting how this can transpose. And I believe this is all theory, a6 and b5. So I could play the bishop back to b3. It's tempting to go bishop d3 because if I play bishop d3, note that knight takes d4, knight takes d4, queen takes d4 would lose on the spot to bishop takes h7 with the discovery on the queen. That's a common device. For some reason, I'm thinking bishop b3 is the way to go, though, so I think I'm going to play that and try to get them to play knight a5. It seems weird to want them to play knight a5 with tempo on my bishop, but it very well may be the case that the knight is better off on c6 than it is on the side of the board over here. So I'm trying to goad them into playing this move so I can bring my bishop back to c2 and possibly go queen d3. It'd be much better to have my queen on d3 with the bishop behind it than having the bishop in front on d3 and having to play queen c2. I'd greatly prefer the queen to lead the battery so I could threaten bishop takes f6. So black plays bishop b7. You always have to look at d5 possibilities when you're white in these positions. I don't think it's appropriate here, but it's something that, if it does work, it's usually highly desirable. Let me just think for a second if there's any forceful way I can play this. I mean, I don't get the sense that black has done anything seriously wrong yet, so I'd be surprised if I had something. I'm thinking about queen d3. Although then they could play knight b4 with tempo, so maybe I'm better off playing like a3 and just covering the b4 square. It's slightly slow, though. So a3, knight a5, bishop c2, knight c4, something along those lines. There's also the issue, like if knight a5 is played, now that the bishop's on b7, black might continue with bishop takes f3, and after queen takes f3, then grab the pawn here. So I want to pause and consider my options right now. I could play bishop c2, but knight b4 once again is an issue. h4 is a move you sometimes see played in these types of positions. Looks a little random and potentially weakening, but it can be helpful to start probing black on the king side. Rook c1. I'm not liking rook c1, even though it puts the rook off on a half-open file. Usually in these setups, you want to bring the rook to d1 rather than c1, even though the c file is open. You're better off putting it behind the d-pawn and trying to push, because if you commit it to c1, usually what happens is there's just an exchange of rooks on the file, which should benefit black because they have a better pawn structure. White's play is predicated on the initiative in these IQPs oftentimes. You don't want to exchange too many pieces. I could play a4, try to get them to play b4, but where's my knight going then? I don't see a great square for it. Queen d2 could be played, but again, knight a5. So I'm looking at various issues involving this knight jump specifically. I mean, I could play queen d3, knight b4, queen back to d2, and just suck it up if black plays bishop takes f3, simply take back with my pawn. But I really would like to avoid the structural damage if I could. What to do? Queen e2 would drop the pawn on d4. And I'm briefly looking at doing that and then playing rook d1, but I don't think it's justified. I know I'm burning time, but I think this is important. So a3, knight a5, bishop c2, bishop takes f3, queen takes f3, queen takes d4, rook d1. They have queen c5, something along those lines. Maybe I have some knight e4 type ideas there, but I'm not seeing anything truly convincing. There's a lot of moves I'd like to play. Again, queen d2, knight a5 could be played. I think I'm going to play queen d3, and then if knight b4, just play, let's say queen d2, bishop takes f3, g takes f3. Just try to play that position. I don't think it'll be all that bad. Yeah, let's do it. Took me longer than I would have liked to make this decision, but again, it's crucial to find a plan once you've made all of the standard moves in the position. Like, I feel like up to this point, my play has been pretty self-explanatory. Maybe you could argue about whether bishop b3 is better than bishop d3. I don't quite know, but it's imperative to find a plan once you've kind of settled into the position. So yeah, let's pull this back now. I'm going to pre-move this capture. I know my kingside pawns are hideous after this, but I will have the two bishops, and getting rid of black's light square bishop is quite valuable in my eyes. So, and black does not take. Okay, that's interesting. So they instead centralize their knight. Here I could play knight e5. A couple moves ago I didn't like knight e5 because my pawn on d4 would have been hanging, but now the circumstances have changed slightly. So sending the knight in becomes a more tempting option. But I guess I could take on c3 and then maybe play knight e4 after that. That's one thing I'd have to look at. So knight e5, knight takes c3, b takes c3, knight e4. And then if I take on e4, they just win the exchange. And meanwhile, it's a fork on the queen and the bishop. So perhaps I should take on f6. If I take f6, they take with a bishop, and then I play like knight to e4, maybe trying to come into c5. Maybe that has some merit. Granted, if bishop takes f6, they could play knight takes f6 as well. But then I go knight e5. It's a position. It's playable. I could play h4, trying to prop up this bishop, but how good is that? Because, again, knight takes c3 with the same idea. Knight e4 could be good, potentially. So you know what? I'm just going to take somewhat of a committal decision, but I think it's all right. Yeah, now my intention was knight e4, jumping in, trying to utilize the c5 square. So I've forfeited the two bishops and have a slightly worse pawn structure, but I'll try to play for activity. Maybe I won't play knight c5 so quickly. I get the sense that black might want to drop the bishop back to e7 to cover the c5 square, in which case maybe I'll even consider knight e5, try to bring that knight in as a complement. Given that d5 is so well blockaded, now I might actually play the rook over to c1, although maybe I should play knight c5 straight away if I'm going to do it, because notice that bishop b4 could be a bother. So perhaps if I'm going to play that, I need to do it ASAP. So knight c5, bishop takes, pawn takes. Yeah, and then we get a protected, or at least pass pawn. I was about to say protected pass pawn. It could be a protected pass pawn if we bring a pawn up to b4 to support it. Okay, I was hoping they might make this move because this seems to blunder this. Although there is bishop b4 to contend with, but that would lose a piece for them. So I think they blundered this move. And I was looking at a couple lines. Like knight d7, let's say the queen moves away to, I don't know, d6. Knight takes f8. They can play bishop b4 then, but I have queen to d3, hitting the pawn on h7, which will slow them down. Yeah, and also there's bishop takes d5 first if I want. Bishop takes d5, then knight here. However, I'm not sure I want to give the attack on f3 so easily. So I think I should do this right away. Oh yeah, and in queen d6, they can't even do what I just mentioned, because that would block the bishop from coming to b4 if they play queen d6. So I'd be free to take on f8 without worrying about bishop b4. So now it becomes a question, like, where do they put the queen? Going to the c file, c6 or c7 is not too appetizing because of potential hits with the rook coming to c1, one of the rooks. Yeah, so they do play to d6. So I think black's just going to play the position and exchange down. So let's go grab that. This is what can happen if you move a little bit too quickly. It seemed like black could have spent some time there and they would have spotted that threat for sure. Okay, here I'm thinking knight e5, which stops the knight f4 incursion. Yeah, let's go ahead and play that. It's natural. Black has twice as much time as me, but I have an extra exchange. I'm happy with that trade-off for now, especially in view of the 2-second increment. So black has a solid position. I mean, this is what sometimes occurs in these IQP setups. Black is crouching behind their better structure. They have 2 pawn islands to my 3. And yeah, the fact that they can play this move is kind of an indicator of their belief in their position. I mean, usually you wouldn't want to offer a queen trade when you're in exchange down, but black is effectively saying he thinks that his structural compensation is enough to offset that material deficit. So I don't know that's actually the case, probably not, but I can see the argument that they're making. I'm probably going to trade. I don't see a huge reason to keep pieces on the board, so yeah, let's go ahead and swap. Bishop takes, so I could play rook ec1, but I'm not threatening to come in anywhere down the c-file. I kind of think rook ed1 is a more responsible move, trying to get this in. And then if they occupy the c-file, maybe then I'll play a rook to c1, rook ac1. What about the line rook ed1, knight f4, f3, knight e2 check, king f1? Yeah, I guess their knight would have to just retreat then. I was thinking knight takes d4 might be possible, but I am covering this. So this is another reason to play this move. It protects the d4 pawn, which was unprotected a moment ago. I might look to maneuver this knight, like maybe I can get it into the c5 square. Here again, this move looks tempting, although knight f4 would be the answer, threatening this pawn and also threatening to come to e2. I could simply take d5. This knight d3 move looks pretty good as well. Again, trying to come into c5. Maybe I'll do that. That also covers f4, incidentally, so I like the look of this move. Yeah, let's make a little retreat. Maybe knight d7 could have been played too, hitting the rook and trying to come to c5 with tempo. Okay, so this is the move that I was kind of waiting for, because now I get to do this and offer a trade that I really don't think black wants to take me up on. If they swap, it's just going to reduce their chances. I mean, trading the queens is one thing, but I think they got to keep a pair of rooks on the board if they're going to be down 2 points of material. Yeah, this is no good for black. Knight c5 is coming next, and awful position for them. I could also take on d5 if I want, but what's the rush? Knight c5 is looking nice. Probably they're going to play bishop c8 and try to hold everything after I do this, but okay, it's virtually a free tempo move on the bishop on b7, so no complaints here. Yeah, so now do I take on d5 and try to saddle them with a bad structure, or do I play a4, maybe try to weaken their structure? I'm thinking a4 is quite good, because if the game goes a4, I suspect they'll play b4, looking to keep the position closed. And then I'm thinking a5, with the intention of playing my bishop to c4 and really winning this pawn. Knight f4 could be played at virtually any time by black, but I would just cover the threat on e2. No biggie there. I wish I could take on e6 with check, but they take with the bishop and simultaneously hold this knight. You know what's an interesting simplifying operation here? Speaking of this undefended bishop, well, there's two things. One, I can take d5 and then play knight e4. Also, maybe I can just play knight e4 right away. It took me a second to see this, but when I was thinking about ways to take advantage of the undefended bishop, this sprung to mind. So yeah, if I play knight e4, I'm unveiling an attack on c8, and I'm also hitting the bishop on d6. And I think his only way to defend would be bishop to c7, but then I'm taking on d5, removing the guard on c7. So I believe that's just going to win material. Yeah, I'm going to play it because this is pretty classic. This is pretty textbook double attack going on here. And we have the bonus of the attack on d5. Okay, that was instructive right at the end here because I didn't immediately see the tactic, but I stuck with it. And if you're white here, your sense of danger should be setting off alarm bells in your head because the opponent's position looks loose. I mean, they're down material for one thing, but the fact that they have two undefended pieces and you have discovered attack potential here is a clear sign that there might be some tactical way to capitalize. Okay, so again, I didn't see it right away, but I looked at initially knight takes a6 and knight takes e6, and that got the wheels turning that suggested there might be something there. Then I looked at bishop takes d5, pawn takes, and knight e4. I was thinking about that line. And then when you're calculating, you want to get in the habit of twisting move orders around. And once you do, you'll find knight e4 eventually, assuming you have the time to do so. I'm getting challenged like crazy now, but I'm going to analyze this game, of course. So going back to the opening stages of this one, this is all standard. And, okay, so after the bishop comes to g5, black played b5. I seem to remember some game like Kasparov versus Anand in this line where Kasparov as white made a d5 advance at the right time. And that's why I pulled the bishop back to b3. I was trying to support the possibility of d5. I just don't quite know the theory well enough here. Even though I said I analyzed this for that repertoire, I don't think I looked at this exact variation with a6 and b5. I could be wrong. Sometimes I forget my analysis, as you guys well know. It's hard to keep track of everything 100% of the time. Because it would be nice to just know this position and be able to spend less time coming up with a move like queen d3. This looks utterly normal the way that black has played it. a6 and b5 is helpful for them staking out space. A move I probably should have considered a little more closely right here after a6 is a4. It's not a terrible option for white to play a4 and try to shut down black's b5 pawn push. So, in hindsight, I wish I would have played a bit less mechanically in the opening. Nevertheless, as played, the position seemed to be okay. I eventually chose d3 and then dropped the queen back to d2, so the game could have taken a lot different of a course had black taken on f3 and doubled my pawns. But, I played setups like that before. I remember a game I had against international master Thomas Bartel in the U.S. Chess League, where I encouraged my opponent to do that, and the doubled pawns are not easy to exploit, and the fact that white will have the bishop pair can make up for the structural damage. So here I took on, sorry about that. There I took on f6 and then played the knight into e4, trying to focus on the c5 square, because it is worth noting that black in this position was threatening to take on c3, and then after I recapture, probably with the pawn, then knight e4 with a fork on the queen and the bishop. Note that in the previous position here, that was not possible because knight e4 I would recapture with my knight. But if black can go here, take my knight, and then play knight e4, then that tactic is on for them. So a crucial moment here after knight c5 because queen b6 is just a blunder. Black has to do something like take the knight or maybe move this bishop to c6. Although if they play bishop c6, I think I'm content to play rook ac1 then, and I have discovered attacks like knight takes e6 threatened. Although it must be said that after bishop c6, rook ac1, queen b6, the bishop on c6 would cover the d7 square. There might be some threats like knight takes, pawn takes, rook takes here, which I'll demonstrate in the analysis board, but this demonstrates that you can't play too quickly here as black. I mean, queen b6 is a one-move blunder, and I'm going to close some of these challenges because I'm just getting mobbed with challenges right now. Sorry, guys. Yeah, I mean, I think queen b6 is almost unrecoverable. Certainly, black shouldn't trade down the way they did, but the damage has already been done once this position is reached. So queen b4 is questionable. I think rook c8 is an autopilot move that cannot possibly be good. You got to keep pieces on the board here if you're black. Trading a pair of rooks is almost a death sentence for black's position. Okay, let's go ahead and look at this one. All right, I like to see the zeros straight down the line. No inaccuracies, mistakes, or blunders. I wish I could play like that all the time. So let's go ahead and look. So we had this Panov-Botvinnik variation. I played everything under the sun against the Caro-Kann. I think theoretically e5 is the strongest move. I mentioned this in my chessable repertoire on traps, on e4 traps, because there was a line I looked at that goes like this, which is kind of trappy. And if you want to know the reason why, check out that repertoire. But the Caro-Kann is a very good defense, and I mean, knight c3, d takes e4 has a ton of theory. I played that recently. Yeah, the advanced variation with e5, same deal. Knight d2 here is played almost interchangeably with knight c3. Black inevitably captures on e4. So we had this trade, and then c4. Panov-Botvinnik variation. Very classical line. A great book for these type of structures, like understanding IQPs in particular, is this book by Grandmaster Alexander Baburin called, I think it's Winning Pawn Structures. I'll get the exact name of the book. In fact, I have it over here. One second, I'm going to try and find it. Yeah, it is Winning Pawn Structures by Baburin. And in fact, this book probably has this exact position that we got to in the middle game in there. I'm not going to look it up right now, but fantastic book. There's no better resource out there for learning IQP positions. It's written for, I'd say, tournament chess players, but I think anyone can glean some information on those. And if you're learning about IQPs, you're probably a bit better anyways. This is like a more advanced structure. So here I'm playing my rook to e1, just getting it on the half-open file. Yeah, so now I mentioned that a4 is a possibility. I could also play the move that the computer was liking, this prophylactic bishop to b3. I just played my bishop out to g5. But if I could go back in time, I would spend more time here just considering what to do. Because even though I felt like I was transposing into a position from the repertoire, at the time I wasn't 100% sure it was the same. I just kind of automatically played the moves that I recommended in that repertoire. Rook e1 and bishop g5. But the position, after a couple more natural moves, proved to be one where I had to think. So I probably should have done my thinking a couple moves prior. So, okay, here I played queen d3. The engine actually wants to take on f6 right away. So how would that pan out? Pawn on Panov, pan out. If I did this and then played d5. Yeah, because in IQP positions, white often wants to get this move in to get rid of the weakness and open lines for his pieces, but here it doesn't look like much of anything. It just looks like some trades. And white doesn't have the bishop pair, so I don't think black has to fear the complications in an open position. The engine says this is dead equal. So that's a bit uninspired taking on f6. I mean, it might be better than queen d3 for all I know, but it's not something I would greatly think about. Yeah, engine doesn't like this very much, and it says black should play bishop takes f3 here. I'll check the theory on this position, but I think this is a clear indication that my play was too routine from moves, let's say, 11 through 13. There might be an improvement somewhere here, and I should have thought about that at the time. That said, I mean, this position doesn't seem completely clear to me. I know the engine says black is slightly better. Maybe the engine is rating this pawn structure a bit negatively, but double isolated pawns right in front of your king are typically a liability, so something to think about. But pawn pusher played knight bd5, and this is a standard maneuver for black, by the way, bringing the knight into the d5 square. Black wants to blockade this pawn, make sure I can't offload it by playing it up. Bishop takes f6, bishop takes f6. Yeah, and here, the engine actually wants to play knight takes. Interesting. So it's correct to withdraw the knight from the blockading square, which it was apparently just settled on, but open up the bishop's attack on f3 again. I probably would have played knight e5, and now b4, knight to, let's say, a4, rook c8, and black is doing fine. The two bishops are in black's possession. Also, d5 has been thwarted. So yeah, I agree. I think black's doing all right here. It's going to be hard to find a plan for white in a couple more moves, I believe. Rook a d1 looks standard, but if I don't get this move in, what am I really doing here? I'm probably playing to get the knight into c5. In that case, I'm not sure rook a d1 even really helps me. So I took on f6 and black took with the bishop, and now I do get to go knight e4, and I felt like my position just went rapidly uphill after this. Mostly because I wanted exchange, but yeah, bishop e7. I can understand bishop e7. I'm not sure it's strictly necessary. The engine wants to play a different move, but I can understand why they played that, just covering c5. Yeah, and here black needs a more sophisticated approach. Like I was mentioning bishop c6, I thought this might be possible. The computer thinks it's okay. Yeah, it does invite this move, though, with tempo, doesn't it? And rook c8, I think black's always going to be hesitant to do that because the a6 pawn is potentially loose. But, yeah, they should have considered this. Something along these lines. Black just let their guard down and allowed knight d7. So, yeah, after this, queen b6, knight d7, it's tough. It's very tough. What's another move they could have thought about here after knight c5? I guess the engine suggestion of rook a7 makes some sense. It's an awkward-looking move, though. I would slightly prefer white here. I very much like my knight on c5. They could take the knight, of course. They could play bishop takes, pawn takes, and maybe play to blockade the c6 square. Let's say this here, maybe knight e7. Yeah, trying to offer a queen trade and bring the knight into a blockading role. This looks acceptable. So black had at least 2 or 3 good possibilities after knight c5, but they just blew it because they didn't pause to think. So knight d7, queen over to d6. Okay, so one line that I thought about for a second was this. And then instead of black taking the knight, going bishop b4, trying to win the exchange back. I think I looked at something like this, though, and I'm wondering how it works out. Playing queen d3, letting them take on e1, and yeah, like eventually recovering. And I guess here I'm up a pawn, and their king is fairly weak. I'm threatening to check and then take on g7. So this is bad for black. So even though in this line the bishop can come to b4, it looks like the way I just demonstrated there, the attack on h7 is quite helpful. And the engine actually even likes this move, giving up the knight right away. How does that work out? So take, and then just make a queen move. Okay, attacking the e6 pawn. I see. So if take here with check, and then win the bishop next move, most likely. So black played queen b6. I took on f8. They recovered. I jumped the knight into e5. I don't want to allow black to play knight f4, supported by their queen, so knight e5 does a good job of cutting the queen's defense of the knight on f4. They could play f6 to try to kick my knight away, but then I get to plunk it on this nice d3 square where it covers f4, and black has a newly weak pawn on e6. Black's really going to be missing the fact that their pawn isn't on f7 anymore, protecting e6. So knight e5, queen b4, and I just swapped. I'm not saying this position is easy for black by any means, but I think they made it pretty simple for me based on the exchanges they offered. Queen coming to b4, and especially later rook c8. Rook c8 was really the move that did them in, I think. So rook d1. They played the bishop back to d6, yep. And I played knight d3. You see, the engine is also suggesting a move that covers the f4 square. So it's saying g3 specifically to rule out knight f4. Because we do want to be heads up that black may try to play this move to open up a double attack on the g2 pawn. So I played knight d3, similar idea, and also trying to reroute the knight. I think I mentioned knight d7 also. Maybe I should have played this move because that's a tempo move. And perhaps I can get the knight here and gain another tempo by attacking the bishop. And if rook c8, probably once again a rook coming to c1. Well, the engine wants to go here. Interesting. And just give up a pawn. Take. Probably bishop takes. Oh, and then this at the end. Right, because the bishop's no longer guarding the rook. And the engine thinks I can win the bishop on c5 cleanly without even having to give a pawn. Note that if bishop c4 take and black takes here, I have b3 and they're pinned on the c file. So certainly knight d7 on move 23 I should have thought about as well. Probably slightly stronger, more forcing. So I played knight d3, and yeah, you just can't play this move rook c8. I know it looks good, you're sending the rook to the open file, but in my mind there's two things that are wrong with that move. One, and this is kind of a minor point, the rook has nowhere to infiltrate here. I mean, all four of these highlighted squares are covered by white's pieces. And two, most importantly, as soon as I play rook c1, you're not gaining anything from that trade. Yeah, you can see the engine's top move is just to play rook d8 and admit that going to the c file was a mistake. So this is a short-sighted move by black, rook c8. Now, as far as how black should play this position, if they are not going to trade, it's tough because now I have a clear plan of bringing the knight into c5, and they might not be able to keep their position together. The move that the computer likes here, a5, is directed against knight c5, so that when that is played, I'm not attacking both the pawn and the bishop. I'm only hitting the bishop. So that's a start at least. But black would have to do their best to keep pieces on the board and keep their structure compact, not allow too many lines to get open as well. So as played, rook c8, and here black cooperated by taking. King f8, and as soon as I get this knight into c5, it's very, very bad. Yeah, and this was the final mistake. I had a feeling they would play that too. I mean, bishop takes c5 is kind of depressing to have to play. I probably would have taken the rook with the rook in that case. Although, I guess this could be played, couldn't it? I have a feeling when my rook comes to c7 at the end, it should be winning. Although, you know, if we get into a position like this, there's still some work to be done. Black does have a bishop plus pawn, so maybe I'd have to exercise a bit more care in such a line so that I didn't lose, like, the d4 pawn. Excuse me. So, on bishop takes c5, yeah, probably taking with the pawn is correct. But as I said, there's still some accuracy needed here. I'm not just going to win simply. Black can play to blockade the c-pawn. I'll have to take my time. Yeah, f3 and probably bring the king up a little bit. Start playing on the queen side. Try to use the extra pawn. Get some activity for my rook too. Just the trouble for black here is, like, now they really can't offer hardly any exchange. If they offer an even exchange when I have the same amount of pawns as they do, it's over. So exchange is very bad in general for black. But they played bishop c8, and yeah, I went knight e4, double attack on the two bishops. And how I was explaining finding this move, I think, is very instructive, because this is what you want to do and strive to do when you're calculating, is try many permutations of the same idea. You know, initially, I didn't really think there was a way to take advantage of this bishop, because I was just looking at the straightforward knight takes a6 or knight takes e6, to which black could respond with a capture themselves. And I didn't think about the backward knight moves. And of course, b7 and d7 are out of the question. Black just covers those. But it took me a little while to look at knight e4. And I actually found it first by looking at this line, which is also pretty good. But just switch that move order up, play the second move first. So we have this continuation, bishop takes d5, e takes d5, knight e4, two-move line. Don't just be satisfied with that. Look for something better. Knight e4 first wins without even giving black a chance. Black's just going to lose a piece. If bishop c7, trying to block, we take, and then take c7. Some line like this. Okay, so I'm going to check the theory on this line, because I think I could have played it better. As I said, I think right here, after a6, a4, not a3 as the computer's saying, but a4 instead, trying to stop b5. is a strong candidate. And I'm going to see if I can find that Kasparov-Anand game. I think it was Kasparov-Anand, if I'm remembering correctly. Because there's a nice idea that was displayed there. And it might be the same or a very similar position. Yeah, and I think black was fine here. Bishop takes f3, probably their best bet at this stage. Anyways, hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I'll be back again soon with another one. Talk to you later.